Judge Thaddeus Crane woke at dawn, as he always did, to the sound of chains dragging across wooden floorboards. The sound came from inside his own mind, a phantom echo that had haunted him for 3 years, ever since the Matthias case. He lay in his 4-poster bed in the grand plantation house on Willow Bend, staring at the ceiling beams his grandfather had hewn from Virginia oak in 1784, and listened to the chains. They were not real. He knew they were not real, but knowing did nothing to silence them. The sound was always the same. Metal links scraping against wood, punctuated by the shuffle of bare feet and the occasional clink of an iron cuff. Sometimes there were voices too, whispered prayers in the darkness, the sound of weeping quickly stifled. These phantom sounds had become so familiar that Thaddeus could distinguish between them, could identify which part of his fractured psyche was producing which torment on any given morning. This morning, it was the heavy drag of leg irons, the kind used for transport, for moving human cargo from one place of suffering to another. The rhythm was steady, methodical, inexorable as death itself. Thaddeus counted the scrapes. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the 5th scrape, his heart would begin to race. On the 10th, sweat would break out across his forehead despite the cool morning air. By the 20th, he would have to sit up, gasping, pressing his palms against his eyes until colored lights bloomed in the darkness behind his eyelids. The bedroom was exactly as it had been when his grandfather built this house 60 years ago. The same Virginia oak floors, now worn smooth by generations of feet, both free and enslaved. The same lead-paned windows overlooking tobacco fields that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean. The same massive fireplace where enslaved hands had stacked wood every winter morning for 6 decades. Everything was preserved, maintained eternal, as if the Crane family's wealth and power would last forever, as if the foundation upon which it all rested was not composed of bodies and blood and screams swallowed by the night. His wife Eleanor slept beside him, her breathing shallow and measured, perfectly controlled even in sleep. She had stopped asking about his nightmares 2 years ago, after he'd woken screaming about blood on the witness stand, about Matthias's eyes staring at him from the gallows, about the sound of the trap door opening and the sudden terrible silence that followed. Eleanor had sat up that night, her face pale in the moonlight, and asked him if he was losing his mind. He had not answered because he did not know, and she had not asked again. Their marriage had been arranged by their families 20 years ago, a union of compatible wealth and social standing. Eleanor Whitfield had been beautiful at 18, with auburn hair and green eyes and a laugh that could light up a room. At 38, she was still beautiful, but in a harder, more brittle way, as if life had slowly crystallized her into something that could not bend without breaking. She maintained the household with ruthless efficiency, managed the servants with firm but fair discipline, and presented the world with the face of a perfect Southern lady. What she thought about the system that sustained their lifestyle, she never said. What she felt about her husband's growing moral crisis, she kept locked behind those green eyes. The servants moved quietly through the house below, preparing breakfast, stoking fires, living their constrained lives within the boundaries he and men like him had drawn for them. Some were enslaved, property of the Crane family, since Thaddeus's grandfather had first cleared this land. Some were free, working for wages that were barely enough to survive, but were still better than bondage. The distinction meant everything and nothing in Willow Bend. Free black citizens could be re-enslaved on the flimsiest of pretexts. Enslaved people could be freed, theoretically, though it happened rarely and only when economically convenient for their enslavers. Thaddeus knew their names, knew their faces, knew which ones had families and which ones had been torn from families and which ones lived in that peculiar purgatory of not knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. He knew that Samuel, who maintained the stables, had a wife on a plantation 20 miles away, whom he could visit only twice a year. He knew that Ruth, who cooked their meals, had been purchased by his father along with her 3 children. Though only she remained, the children sold south when times had been hard 15 years ago. He knew that Marcus, who tended the tobacco fields, had tried to run away twice and bore the scars of his recapture on his back. He knew all this, had known it for years, and had done nothing, had told himself it was not his business, that he was a judge, not a plantation manager, that his duty was to law, not to the lives ground beneath it. The chains in his mind reminded him every morning of the cost of that willful blindness. Thaddeus rose and dressed himself, something he'd insisted on doing since childhood, despite Eleanor's protests that it was unseemly for a man of his station. "A gentleman should have a valet," she said. "A man of property should not perform menial tasks." But Thaddeus could not bear the thought of another person's hands on him, adjusting his collar, fastening his buttons, treating him with the deference that was really just fear wrapped in courtesy. He pulled on his black wool trousers, heavy and hot, even in the mild Virginia spring. His white linen shirt, starched stiff by hands he could not see but whose labor he benefited from. His vest with its silver buttons, each one engraved with the Crane family crest, a crane bird standing on one leg above the motto, "Constant and True." The irony of that motto had begun to burn like acid 3 years ago. Constant in what? True to what? In the mirror above his washstand, he saw a man of 42 who looked 60. His hair had gone entirely grey in the past 3 years, not gradually but in patches, as if terror itself was bleaching him from the inside out. His eyes, once a sharp blue that Eleanor had said reminded her of summer skies, had faded to the color of winter ice, or the eyes of a corpse too long exposed to the elements. His face had hollowed. His skin had gone sallow, and there were tremors in his hands that no amount of whiskey could still. The face in the mirror was the face of a haunted man. But what haunted him was not supernatural. No ghosts walked the halls of the Crane plantation. No spirits rattled chains in the night. What haunted Thaddeus was memory and conscience, and a terrible understanding that he was complicit in atrocities that would stain his soul forever. He splashed water on his face from the porcelain basin, water carried up from the well by enslaved hands, warmed over a fire tended by enslaved hands, poured into this basin by enslaved hands. Every comfort of his life rested on the labor of people who had no choice, no freedom, no hope of anything better. And he had spent 15 years telling himself this was natural, this was how the world worked, this was not his responsibility to question or change. The dining room smelled of coffee and bacon, rich scents that should have been comforting, but instead made his stomach turn. The coffee had been grown by enslaved people on Caribbean plantations, shipped north by enslaved labor, prepared in his kitchen by Ruth's skilled but unfree hands. The bacon came from pigs raised on his own land by Marcus and the other field workers, slaughtered and cured and cooked, every step of the process depending on stolen labor. Thaddeus took his place at the head of the table, a position that symbolized his authority over this household, over the lives within it, over the system that sustained it all. The table itself was mahogany from the West Indies, another product of enslaved labor. The chair was upholstered in leather from cattle raised by enslaved cowhands in Texas. The very walls of this room had been built by his grandfather's enslaved workers, their names forgotten, but their labor preserved in every brick and beam. He had no appetite, but he unfolded the Richmond Enquirer anyway, spreading it across the table like a map of a country tearing itself apart. The headlines spoke of debates in Washington about the gag rule, Representative John Quincy Adams's continued insistence that petitions against slavery be read in Congress, the fierce opposition from Southern representatives who saw any discussion of slavery as an existential threat to their way of life. There were advertisements for runaway enslaved people, entire columns of them describing human beings like livestock. Negro man, answers to Jim, scar on left cheek, $100 reward. Mulatto woman, about 25 years, skilled seamstress, $200 reward. Each advertisement a small horror, a life reduced to a bounty, a person transformed into property that had wandered off and needed to be recaptured. There were auction notices too, estate sales where entire families would be broken up and sold to the highest bidder. Excellent field hands, breeding stock, house servants. The language was clinical, commercial, designed to make the monstrous seem mundane, and it worked. Men read these advertisements over their breakfast and saw nothing unusual, nothing worth questioning. This was simply commerce, simply the natural order of things. Representative Adams was still fighting in Congress, still insisting that free speech meant something, even when that speech challenged the foundations of Southern power. The gag rule had been reimposed again, forbidding any discussion of abolition petitions, but Adams found procedural ways around it. Standing on the House floor day after day, an old man refusing to be silenced even as younger, angrier men threatened him with censure, with expulsion, with violence. Thaddeus had followed Adams's career for years, first with contempt for a man he'd seen as a northern fanatic trying to impose his morality on the South, then with growing respect, and finally with something like admiration. Adams was 80 years old now, but he had more courage than any 10 Southern gentlemen combined. He faced death threats regularly. He was denounced in Southern newspapers as a traitor and a race mixer. His own party had abandoned him, but he kept fighting, kept insisting that the Constitution's promise of freedom meant something, or should mean something, or needed to mean something if the Republic was going to survive. Thaddeus folded the paper and pushed it aside. The headlines always left him feeling hollowed out, confronted with the reality that the entire nation was locked in a death grip over whether human beings could be property. Half the country said yes, absolutely. This is our way of life, and our prosperity, and our sacred right. The other half said no, or increasingly said no, though many said it quietly, afraid of the consequences of speaking too loud. And what did Thaddeus say? For 15 years, he had said yes with his rulings, yes with his sentences, yes with every verdict that upheld the system even when his conscience screamed that it was wrong. He had told himself he was just following the law, just doing his duty, just being a neutral arbiter of statutes written by other men. But neutrality in the face of atrocity was not neutrality, it was complicity. It was choosing the side of the powerful against the powerless and pretending that choice was inevitable, that he had no agency, that he was just a cog in a machine too big for any individual to resist. Eleanor entered, her morning dress rustling, the sound of expensive silk moving across expensive petticoats. She was 38, but maintained the grace of her youth through careful attention to every detail of her appearance and manner. Her hair was arranged perfectly, her posture was flawless, her expression was pleasantly neutral. She had been trained from birth to be a Southern lady, which meant she knew how to make horror look like hospitality, how to smile while the world burned, how to maintain perfect composure even as everything around her crumbled. "You look tired," she said, which was her way of saying he looked terrible, which was her way of saying she was worried but would never admit to worry, because Southern ladies did not worry, they endured. "Another case today," Thaddeus replied, hearing the exhaustion in his own voice. "The Peterson matter." Eleanor's lips tightened almost imperceptibly, a tiny compression that was the only outward sign of her inner turmoil. She knew what the Peterson matter involved. Everyone in Willow Bend knew. Everyone in 3 counties knew. Robert Peterson, a free black man who ran a small cooperage on the edge of town, had been accused of harboring runaways. The evidence was circumstantial at best, fabricated at worst, but the accusation alone was enough to destroy him. Peterson had built his business over 30 years, starting with nothing, working 18-hour days, saving every penny, slowly accumulating the capital to buy his freedom, then to buy tools, then to buy a small plot of land where he built his workshop. He made barrels, good barrels, better than most white coopers could make. Plantation owners bought from him because his work was superior, even as they resented having to do business with a free black man, even as they looked for reasons to bring him down. Now they had their reason, or had manufactured one. 3 enslaved people from neighboring plantations had disappeared over the past 6 months. All 3 had last been seen in the vicinity of Peterson's cooperage. No one had actually seen Peterson with any runaways. No one had seen anyone enter or leave his workshop at suspicious hours. But his property was near the Appomattox River, which meant it was near a potential escape route north, and that was enough for the accusation to stick. If Thaddeus ruled against Peterson, the man would lose his freedom, his business, his entire life. He would be sold south, probably to work in Louisiana's sugar fields, where life expectancy was measured in years. His workshop would be seized and sold, probably to one of the white coopers who'd been envying his success. His wife and children, if they couldn't prove their freedom papers were in order, might be enslaved too. An entire family destroyed, an entire life's work obliterated, because white men needed to believe that free black success was dangerous, was threatening, was something that needed to be crushed before it inspired others to want freedom too. If Thaddeus ruled for Peterson, Thaddeus himself would face the wrath of every plantation owner in 3 counties. They would see it as a judge choosing black freedom over white property rights, as a violation of the unspoken code that governed Virginia society. They would move to have him removed from the bench. They would ostracize Eleanor and their children. They would make sure the Crane family understood that there were consequences for choosing the wrong side. Eleanor set her teacup down with precise delicacy, the china clicking against the saucer with a sound like breaking bones. "Do what you must," she said, which meant do what will keep us safe, which meant protect this family even if it costs Peterson his freedom, which meant she already knew what Thaddeus would choose because he had always chosen safety before, had always chosen the system over the individual, had always taken the path that preserved his position and his privileges. Thaddeus rode to the courthouse through morning fog that clung to the tobacco fields like funeral shrouds. The fog was thick and damp, carrying the smell of river water and turned earth and something else, something darker that Thaddeus could never quite name but always recognized. It was the smell of a place built on suffering, a land watered with tears and blood, soil enriched by the bodies of people worked to death and buried without markers. The road from the Crane plantation to Willow Bend proper wound through 3 miles of tobacco fields, all of them worked by enslaved labor. Thaddeus could see them already, even in the early morning. Bent figures moving through the rows, their movements rhythmic and mechanical, efficiency beaten into their bodies over years of repetition. Some sang as they worked, low songs that carried across the fields like prayers or warnings. Most worked in silence, conserving their energy for the long day ahead. He passed the Johnson plantation, where an overseer named McCreary was known for his particular cruelty, past the Henderson place, where the enslaved people were kept in quarters so cramped that disease swept through them every winter, past the Ashland estate, the largest in the county, where Matthew Ashland's father presided over 500 souls who existed only to produce his wealth and comfort. Willow Bend itself was a modest town of perhaps 2,000 people, split between white and black residents, with the black population further divided between enslaved and free. The town had a courthouse, a general store, a bank, a Presbyterian church, a Methodist church, a Baptist church, 3 taverns, 2 brothels, and a single schoolhouse that served white children only. It had been founded in 1778 by veterans of the Revolutionary War who'd received land grants from Virginia as payment for their service fighting for freedom, and who had immediately turned that land into slave plantations because freedom, apparently, was only meant for certain people. Willow Bend's courthouse was a modest brick building in the center of town, flanked by the general store and the Presbyterian church. It had been the site of justice and injustice in equal measure for 60 years. Every judge who had presided there had enforced the slave codes, upheld the fugitive slave laws, ruled that black testimony against white accusers was inadmissible, sentenced enslaved people to horrific punishments for tiny infractions, or for defending themselves, or for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thaddeus had presided there for 15 years, and he was no different from his predecessors. He had done his part to maintain the system, to keep the machinery of oppression running smoothly. The courthouse steps were worn smooth by generations of feet. How many enslaved people had climbed these steps in chains? How many free black citizens had climbed them in fear, knowing the law would not protect them? How many white men had climbed them in confidence, knowing the law existed primarily to protect their property, their power, their presumed superiority? Thaddeus dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. His hands were shaking. The chains in his mind were loud now, deafening, drowning out almost every other thought. He could smell blood again, could see Matthias's face, could hear the sound of the trapdoor opening and the rope snapping taut. Inside, the courtroom was already filling. Planters and their wives occupied the front rows, dressed in their finest. They came to these proceedings like they came to horse races, eager for entertainment and the reaffirmation of their power. In the back, separated by an unspoken but rigidly enforced boundary, sat the town's free black population and the few abolition-sympathetic whites who dared attend. Robert Peterson stood at the defendant's table with his attorney, a young man from Richmond named Harrison, who'd taken the case pro bono and would likely never get another client in Virginia for his trouble. Peterson was a solidly built man in his 50s, with calloused hands and the upright bearing of someone who'd built his freedom through decades of careful backbreaking work. He did not look at Thaddeus. No one in his position could afford to look a judge in the eye. The prosecutor was Matthew Ashland, the son of the county's largest plantation owner. Matthew was 28, educated at William and Mary, and possessed the casual cruelty that came from never having been denied anything in his life. He laid out his case with theatrical flair. 3 enslaved people from neighboring plantations had disappeared over the past 6 months. All 3 had last been seen in the vicinity of Peterson's cooperage. Witnesses, all white, testified to seeing suspicious activity around Peterson's property at night. Harrison's cross-examination revealed that these witnesses had never actually seen Peterson with any runaways, had never seen anyone enter or leave his cooperage after dark, had merely seen lights burning late, which Peterson explained by noting he often worked through the night to fill orders. But facts mattered less than fear, and Ashland was selling fear to a courtroom full of people who wanted to buy it. During the midday recess, Thaddeus retreated to his chambers. The room was small and stuffy, lined with law books he'd once believed contained answers. He sat at his desk and put his head in his hands. The chains were back, dragging through his skull. He could smell blood, though there was no blood. He could hear screaming, though the courthouse was silent. 3 years ago, he had presided over the case of an enslaved man named Matthias, who'd struck his overseer in self-defense. The overseer had been beating Matthias's wife with a leather strap. Matthias had pushed the man away. That push, that single moment of protecting the woman he loved, had been classified as assault. Under Virginia law, an enslaved person who struck a white person could be executed. Thaddeus had known, even as he delivered the sentence, that it was wrong, not just legally questionable or morally ambiguous, but fundamentally, absolutely wrong. Matthias had been hanged on a Tuesday morning in the courthouse square. His wife had been sold south, and Thaddeus had gone home to his dinner and his comfortable bed. And that night, the chains had started. He had tried to convince himself he had no choice, that he was bound by law, that his duty was to interpret statutes, not to question them. But in the 3 years since, he had learned that having no choice was itself a choice. Every morning, he woke to those chains and knew that he was as much a prisoner as any enslaved person in Virginia, locked inside a system that required him to commit atrocities to maintain his position within it. A knock on the door interrupted his spiral. "Judge Crane, they're ready to reconvene." Thaddeus returned to the bench. Ashland called his final witness, a plantation overseer named Hackett, who testified that he'd personally seen Peterson speaking with one of the runaways the day before the man disappeared. Under Harrison's cross-examination, Hackett admitted he'd been drinking that day, admitted the conversation he'd witnessed had taken place in broad daylight on a public road, admitted he couldn't actually recall what had been said. Then Harrison called Peterson to testify. The courtroom tensed. A black man's testimony against white witnesses was virtually worthless in Virginia law, but Harrison was forcing the issue, making the racism explicit. Peterson spoke clearly and calmly. "I run a cooperage. I make barrels for flour, barrels for tobacco, barrels for whatever folks need. I work honest. I pay my taxes. I ain't harbored nobody, runaway or otherwise. These accusations, they ain't about what I done, they're about what I am." Ashland objected. The spectators murmured. Thaddeus felt something crack inside his chest. "Mr. Peterson," Thaddeus said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears, "are you suggesting this court is motivated by prejudice?" Peterson looked at him then, really looked at him, and Thaddeus saw in the man's eyes a knowledge that was almost unbearable. Peterson knew exactly what Thaddeus was. He knew Thaddeus was a coward dressed in judicial robes. "I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that the law in this courtroom ain't the same law for everybody, and I'm suggesting that everybody here knows it, even if most of them won't say it." The courtroom erupted. Ashland demanded Peterson be held in contempt. The planters in the front rows shouted for order, for punishment, for an example to be made. And in the back, the free black citizens sat in absolute silence, watching Thaddeus with the intensity of people watching their entire future balance on the edge of a knife. Thaddeus banged his gavel. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Order! Order in this court!" The room settled into a tense quiet. Thaddeus could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. The chains in his mind were screaming now, so loud he could barely think. He looked at Peterson. He looked at Ashland. He looked at the sea of faces, white and black, all waiting for him to choose. He had spent 3 years telling himself he had no choice. But standing there, with Peterson's words still hanging in the air, Thaddeus realized that narrative had been a lie. He told himself to sleep at night. He had always had a choice. He had simply chosen comfort over conscience. "This case," Thaddeus began, and his voice was shaking, "is built on a foundation of assumptions that I can no longer pretend are just. Mr. Ashland has presented no material evidence linking Mr. Peterson to any crime. He has presented speculation, coincidence, and the testimony of witnesses whose credibility is, at best, questionable." Ashland stood. "Your Honor, You must sit down, Mr. Ashland." Thaddeus's voice gained strength. "I have presided over this courtroom for 15 years. I have rendered verdicts that kept me awake at night. I have enforced laws that I knew in my soul were wrong. And I have told myself every single time that I was simply doing my duty. But duty to what? Duty to a system that treats human beings as property. Duty to laws designed specifically to preserve that system." The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Eleanor, sitting in the second row, had gone pale. "Mr. Peterson," Thaddeus continued, You said the law is not the same for everybody, and you are correct. It is not. It is designed not to be, and I am done pretending otherwise. This case is dismissed. You are free to go." For 3 full seconds, no one moved. Then the courtroom exploded into chaos. The planters were on their feet, shouting. Someone threw something that shattered against the wall. Ashland was screaming about appeals, about impeachment, about insurrection. Harrison stood frozen at his table, staring at Thaddeus in disbelief. Peterson, for his part, simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement that cost nothing and meant everything, before Harrison pulled him toward the door. Thaddeus banged his gavel again and again, but order was not coming back. Not today. Not ever. That night, Thaddeus sat in his study, drinking whiskey and waiting. The house was dark. Eleanor had taken the children to her sister's in Richmond. The servants had fled. He was alone in the house his grandfather built, surrounded by books and furniture and the accumulated weight of generations of Cranes who had never questioned the world they lived in. Around midnight, he heard horses, voices, the sound of men who'd been drinking gathering courage. He'd known they would come. Men like Ashland did not accept challenges to their power quietly. Thaddeus went to the front door and opened it. 15 or 20 men stood in his yard, torches burning, faces twisted with rage. Ashland was at their front. "Judge Crane!" Ashland called, his voice thick with whiskey and contempt. "You've made a grievous error, one that threatens the very fabric of our society. We're here to offer you a chance to reconsider, to recognize that your temporary madness today was a mistake." "It was not a mistake," Thaddeus said. "It was the first honest thing I've done in 3 years." "Then you leave us no choice." Ashland gestured, and 2 men came forward carrying a rope. Thaddeus looked at that rope and felt, for the first time in 3 years, a moment of perfect clarity. This was what awaited anyone who challenged the system. This was the price of conscience, and he found, to his surprise, that he was willing to pay it. "Do what you came to do," he said. But before they could move, another sound cut through the night. Horses. More of them. From the darkness emerged a group of men on horseback, but these were not planters. They were merchants, tradesmen, a few farmers, and at their head was Peterson's attorney, Harrison. "Gentlemen," Harrison called out, his voice carrying across the yard, "if you harm Judge Crane, you'll answer for it. We've sent word to Richmond. The governor's office knows what happened here today. You lynch a sitting judge, and it won't matter how many slaves you own. You'll hang for it." It was a bluff. Thaddeus could see it in Harrison's eyes. But Ashland and his mob couldn't be sure, and uncertainty was enough to fracture their resolve. They stood in the yard for another long moment, torches burning, before Ashland spat on the ground and turned his horse. "You're finished in Virginia, Crane," he called back. "You and everyone fool enough to stand with you." The mob dispersed into the darkness. Harrison and his group remained. "Thank you," Thaddeus said, though the words felt inadequate. "Don't thank me yet," Harrison replied. "He's right. You are finished here. They'll have your position by next week. They'll make sure you never work in law again. They'll burn your reputation and your livelihood to ash." "I know." "Then why did you do it?" Thaddeus looked up at the stars, visible now that the torches had gone. "Because I was tired of the chains." Harrison frowned, not understanding, but that was all right. Some things couldn't be explained. The next morning, Thaddeus woke at dawn. For the first time in 3 years there were no chains, no phantom sounds of suffering. The courthouse had already sent word that he was suspended pending a formal inquiry, which was another way of saying he was fired. His colleagues had abandoned him. His social circle had evaporated overnight. Eleanor had sent a letter saying she would stay with her sister until matters were resolved, which they both knew meant forever. Thaddeus had lost everything. His position, his reputation, his family, his future. But as he dressed in the empty house, he realized he had gained something more valuable. He could look at himself in the mirror. Over the following weeks, the fallout spread like wildfire through Virginia's legal community. Thaddeus's ruling in the Peterson case was overturned by a higher court, not on its merits, but on the grounds that Thaddeus had shown judicial bias. Peterson was arrested again, this time on new charges that were even more transparently false. But Harrison defended him again, and this time they had momentum. News of Thaddeus's stand spread beyond Willow Bend. Abolition societies in the North wrote articles about the judge who chose conscience. Southern newspapers branded him a traitor and a madman, but something had shifted. Other judges, other lawyers, other ordinary citizens began to question what they had been told was unquestionable. Thaddeus left Virginia in November on a cold morning when frost covered the tobacco fields. He took a coach north to Philadelphia, where Harrison had secured him a position with an abolition legal society. It paid almost nothing. It would never restore what he had lost, but it was honest work. On his last morning in Willow Bend, he rode past the courthouse one final time. The building looked exactly as it always had, brick and stolid and seemingly eternal. But Thaddeus knew now that institutions were not eternal. They were maintained by the choices of individuals, and individuals could choose differently. He thought about Matthias, hanged 3 years ago for protecting his wife. He thought about Peterson, whose cooperage had been burned down in the night after the trial. He thought about all the people, enslaved and free, whose lives had been destroyed by a system that declared itself just while committing endless atrocities. The terror of that system was not in its violence, though the violence was real. The terror was in its normalcy, in how easily good people convinced themselves that their complicity was necessary, that they had no choice, that this was simply how the world worked. Thaddeus had been one of those people. For 15 years, he had been one of those people. But he was not anymore. Philadelphia was cold and dirty and overwhelming after the rural quiet of Willow Bend. Thaddeus rented a small room in a boarding house near the Delaware River, where the smell of fish and tar mingled with coal smoke. The Abolition Legal Society operated out of a cramped office above a printer's shop, and Thaddeus's desk was wedged between filing cabinets and boxes of pamphlets. His first case was defending a woman named Sarah who'd fled enslavement in Maryland. Her former enslaver had tracked her to Philadelphia and was seeking her return under the Fugitive Slave Act. Sarah was 19 years old. She'd been pregnant when she ran. Her baby had been born free in Pennsylvania, but the law said the baby was property too. Because Sarah was property, because the law was designed to treat human beings as objects that could be owned and traded. Thaddeus lost the case. The judge, a federal appointee with ties to Southern interests, ruled that Sarah must be returned. Thaddeus watched as marshals took her from the courtroom, her baby screaming in her arms. He watched as she looked back at him with the same expression Peterson had worn. That look that said, "I know what you are, I know what you're trying to do, and I know it probably won't be enough." That night, Thaddeus sat in his small room and considered drinking himself unconscious. But the chains didn't come back. They were quiet. Because even though he'd lost, even though Sarah was gone, he had not been the instrument of her destruction. He had fought for her. He had tried. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was different. Over the next months, Thaddeus threw himself into the work. He defended runaways. He sued enslavers. He filed brief after brief, challenging the legal foundations of slavery itself. He lost more cases than he won. He received death threats. Someone threw a brick through his window with a note that said "Traitor." Harrison, working in Richmond, wrote letters describing how their former colleagues would cross the street to avoid speaking to him. But there were victories too, small and hard-won. A girl named Lucy won her freedom through a technicality in Maryland law. A man named James avoided extradition because Thaddeus found a witness who testified the man had been freed by his enslaver's will. Each victory was temporary, each success fragile, but they accumulated like stones, building a wall against the tide. In February, Thaddeus received a letter from Eleanor. She was filing for divorce on grounds of abandonment. She was taking his name from their children. She wanted him to know that his actions had destroyed not just his own life, but theirs as well, and she hoped he was satisfied with his principles. Thaddeus read the letter twice, then burned it in his fireplace. He was not satisfied. He would never be satisfied. But he was no longer a coward, and that mattered. Spring came to Philadelphia with cherry blossoms and warming rain. Thaddeus was walking to the office one morning when he saw a familiar face on the street. Peterson, the cooperage owner from Willow Bend, alive and here, carrying a bag of tools. "Mr. Peterson," Thaddeus called out. Peterson turned, recognized him, and after a moment's hesitation approached. "Judge Crane, or I guess it's just Mr. Crane now." "It is. I heard they burned your business." "They did. Came at night with torches and righteous anger like they always do." Peterson's voice was calm, stating facts. "But I rebuilt. Not in Willow Bend. Couldn't stay there. But I rebuilt up in Pennsylvania, in a little town outside Pittsburgh, got a new cooperage going. Actually doing better than I was before, if you can believe that. I'm glad." They stood there in the spring sunlight, two men who had lost everything and gained something harder to name. "Why'd you do it?" Peterson asked. "That day in court. You had to know what it would cost you." Thaddeus thought about his answer carefully. "I was haunted," he finally said, "by the choices I'd made before, by a man named Matthias, who I sentenced to hang for protecting his wife. I couldn't keep making those choices, not and remain who I thought I was." Peterson nodded slowly. "Matthias. I knew him. Knew his wife, too, before they sold her south. Good people. Didn't deserve what happened to them. No one deserves what this system does to them. That's truth." Peterson shifted his bag to his other shoulder. "You know what the real terror is, Judge. Not the whips, not the chains, not even the selling of families. The real terror is how normal it all is, how people like Ashland go to church on Sunday and think they're good Christians, how judges like you used to be can sleep at night after sending innocent folks to their death. The terror is the lie that makes it all seem necessary and right." Thaddeus felt those words like a physical blow because they were absolutely correct. The horror of slavery was not just in its violence, but in its banality, in how thoroughly it had convinced good people to commit evil and call it duty. "I can't undo what I did," Thaddeus said quietly. "I can't bring Matthias back. I can't make it right." "No, you can't, but you can stop doing it. You can choose different. You did choose different. That matters, even if it doesn't fix what came before." They parted ways, Peterson heading to a hardware store and Thaddeus continuing to his office. But that conversation stayed with him. Peterson was right. The system's greatest weapon was its ability to convince people they had no choice, that their complicity was inevitable, that resistance was futile or fanatical. But people did have choices. Thaddeus had proven that. He had chosen conscience over comfort, justice over security. And while that choice had cost him dearly, it had also broken the chains that had bound him to a system of atrocity. In May, Thaddeus was working late in the office when Harrison arrived from Richmond, looking exhausted. He'd been traveling for 2 days on bad roads. "I have news," Harrison said, collapsing into a chair. "They've disbarred me. The Virginia State Bar decided my defense of Peterson and others like him constitutes conduct unbecoming an attorney. I'm done in Virginia." Thaddeus poured them both whiskey from the bottle he kept in his desk. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I knew what I was risking." Harrison drank deeply. "The thing that gets me is how they did it with such righteousness. Like they were protecting the integrity of the profession. Like justice means protecting the powerful from the powerless. And anyone who suggests otherwise is a radical, threatening social order." "That's exactly what they believe," Thaddeus said. "That's what I used to believe before I understood what that order was built on." They drank in silence for a moment. Then Harrison said, "There's more. Peterson's been arrested again. Different charges, different judge, but same goal. They want to make him an example. They want to show what happens to free black folks who get uppity." Thaddeus felt rage building in his chest. "When's the trial?" 3 weeks, in Richmond, federal court this time. "We have to go back." Harrison looked at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "Thaddeus, they'll arrest us the moment we cross into Virginia. We're not exactly welcome there." "Then they'll arrest us. But we can't let Peterson face this alone." It was insane. It was possibly suicidal. But it was also necessary, because Peterson was right about the real terror being the normalization of atrocity. And the only way to fight that normalization was to keep showing up, keep resisting, keep insisting that human beings could not be property no matter what the law said. They left for Richmond the next morning. The journey south felt like traveling backward through time, away from the fragile freedom of Philadelphia and back into the heart of the beast. Virginia in May was beautiful, with green fields and blooming dogwoods, which made the horror easier to ignore. Thaddeus saw enslaved people working in those fields, saw the mansions built on their labor, saw the entire edifice of Southern society resting on a foundation of bodies. Richmond was larger and more cosmopolitan than Willow Bend, but the same dynamics applied. Thaddeus and Harrison checked into a boarding house run by a free black woman named Martha, who'd made it clear she supported the abolition cause. Other guests included a journalist from New York and a pair of Quakers who'd come to bear witness. The trial was scheduled for federal court, which meant Judge Bartholomew Hendricks presiding. Hendricks was 67, a Virginia native, and a slaveholder himself. He was also, Thaddeus had heard, a man of some legal acumen who prided himself on following procedure precisely. That might be their only advantage. The courtroom was packed when they arrived. Thaddeus saw familiar faces from Willow Bend. Ashland was there, sitting with his father and several other plantation owners. They stared at Thaddeus with undisguised hatred. Other faces he didn't know filled the gallery, a mix of people who'd come to see justice and people who'd come to see an example made. Peterson sat at the defense table, wearing his best clothes, which were nevertheless patched and worn. He looked older than he had in Philadelphia, the weight of constant persecution visible in the set of his shoulders. The charges were conspiracy to incite insurrection. The prosecution claimed Peterson had been distributing abolition literature and encouraging enslaved people to flee. The evidence consisted of several pamphlets found near his new cooperage in Pennsylvania, and testimony from white witnesses who claimed to have overheard Peterson speaking about freedom. It was, Thaddeus thought, even more transparently fabricated than the charges in Willow Bend, but that didn't matter. The point wasn't conviction based on evidence. The point was sending a message. This is what happens when you challenge us. Harrison stood to make the opening argument. Judge Hendricks looked at him over spectacles and said, "Mr. Harrison, I understand you are no longer a member of the Virginia Bar." "That is correct, Your Honor. However, this is federal court, and I remain a member of the Pennsylvania Bar in good standing." Hendricks considered this. The courtroom held its breath. Then the judge nodded. "Proceed." Harrison's argument was sharp and methodical. He dissected the prosecution's case piece by piece, showing how every element rested on assumption rather than fact, on prejudice rather than evidence. He pointed out that owning abolition literature was not illegal in Pennsylvania, where Peterson now lived. He demonstrated that the witnesses were either mistaken or lying. He built a wall of reasonable doubt, brick by careful brick. Then Thaddeus took the stand as a character witness. It was unusual, possibly even improper, but Hendricks allowed it. "Mr. Crane, The prosecutor began, a slick lawyer named Whitmore, who'd been specially brought in for this case. You were a judge in Virginia for 15 years, is that correct? It is. And you were removed from that position under controversial circumstances? I was suspended for ruling according to my conscience, rather than according to the prejudices of those around me. Whitmore smiled. Your Honor, I move that answer be stricken as non-responsive. Sustained. Mr. Crane, please answer the question asked. Yes, I was removed from my position. And is it true that you now work for an abolition society in Philadelphia? Yes. So your testimony here today is motivated by your political beliefs rather than any actual knowledge of Mr. Peterson's character. Thaddeus met Whitmore's eyes. My testimony is motivated by my knowledge that Mr. Peterson is a man of integrity who has been repeatedly persecuted for the crime of existing while black and free. My political beliefs, as you call them, are simply the recognition that human beings cannot be property. If that makes me radical, then the problem is not with me, but with a society that considers such a statement controversial. The courtroom erupted again. Hendricks banged his gavel. Whitmore demanded Thaddeus be held in contempt. But Thaddeus saw something flicker in the judge's eyes, just for a moment. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition. The trial lasted 3 days. Testimony piled on testimony. Whitmore tried to paint Peterson as a dangerous insurrectionist. Harrison methodically destroyed every claim. And through it all, Peterson himself remained quiet and dignified, a living refutation of every racist assumption that underlay the charges against him. On the 3rd day, Judge Hendricks retired to consider his verdict. The courtroom waited in tense silence. Thaddeus sat with Harrison and Peterson, expecting the worst, hoping for the impossible. When Hendricks returned, his face was unreadable. He took his seat at the bench, shuffled some papers, and then began to speak. This court, he said slowly, is obligated to follow the law as written, not as we might wish it to be. The charges against Mr. Peterson are conspiracy to incite insurrection, which requires proof of specific intent and specific actions toward that end. Thaddeus felt his heart sinking. This was the language of conviction. However, Hendricks continued, after reviewing the evidence presented, this court finds that the prosecution has failed to meet its burden of proof. The pamphlets in question were found on Mr. Peterson's property in Pennsylvania, where their possession is legal. The testimony of the witnesses is contradictory and uncorroborated. There is no credible evidence that Mr. Peterson has conspired to commit any crime. Thaddeus gripped the table's edge. Furthermore, Hendricks said, and now his voice took on a harder edge, this court cannot help but observe that Mr. Peterson has been subjected to repeated prosecution on increasingly tenuous grounds. While this court takes no position on the broader questions of slavery and abolition, it does take a position on the abuse of judicial process to persecute individuals. Such abuse undermines the very concept of law itself. The prosecution half of the courtroom was silent with shock. The defense half was afraid to breathe. The defendant is found not guilty on all charges and is free to go. Furthermore, this court orders that Mr. Peterson's legal expenses be paid by the Commonwealth of Virginia as compensation for the malicious prosecution he has endured. This matter is concluded. Hendricks brought down his gavel, stood, and left the bench before anyone could react. For 5 seconds, absolute silence, then chaos. Peterson's supporters rushed forward. The prosecution's people shouted about appeals, about outrage, about the world turning upside down. Harrison sat frozen, staring at the bench. Peterson himself simply closed his eyes and breathed. Thaddeus felt something break open inside his chest. Not victory, exactly. One verdict didn't change the system, but possibility. Proof that even within the system's machinery, individuals could choose justice over oppression. They left the courthouse in a group, Peterson surrounded by supporters. Outside, the evening sun painted Richmond in gold. Thaddeus saw Ashland and his father across the street. Watching with barely concealed fury, he met Ashland's gaze and didn't look away. That night, they celebrated in Martha's boarding house. Food appeared, wine flowed, and for a few hours they allowed themselves to feel the win. But Thaddeus couldn't fully join the celebration. He kept thinking about Matthias, about all the people who hadn't gotten unexpected justice from unexpected judges. One victory didn't balance the scales. Peterson found him standing by the window, looking out at Richmond's lamplit streets. "You're thinking about him," Peterson said. "Matthias, always. You can't save everyone, can't undo everything. But you changed, Judge. That matters. Hendricks saw what you did, how you sacrificed everything to do right. That influenced him. Maybe not consciously, but it did. Your choice rippled out, touched other people, changed what they thought was possible. It's not enough. No, but it's something. And something is what we build on." Thaddeus turned to face him. "What will you do now?" Peterson smiled, a rare expression. "Go back to Pennsylvania. Make my barrels, live my life, and maybe when folks come through who need help, I'll help them. Quietly, carefully, but I'll help them. Because that's what free people do. We help each other get free." The next morning, Thaddeus and Harrison began the journey back to Philadelphia. As they rode north, leaving Virginia behind, Thaddeus thought about freedom, not as an abstract concept, but as a daily practice, a series of choices made over and over again. He had spent 15 years choosing comfort, choosing complicity, choosing the safety of the system over the suffering it caused. He had believed he had no choice, but that belief itself had been the real prison, chains forged from fear and self-deception. Breaking those chains hadn't freed anyone else. Matthias was still dead. Countless others were still enslaved. The system ground on, but Thaddeus was no longer part of its machinery. He had removed himself from the engine of oppression and repositioned himself against it. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was necessary. Philadelphia welcomed them back with rain and river fog. Thaddeus returned to his small room, his cramped office, his cases that he lost more often than he won. But he returned to them lighter somehow, no longer burdened by the phantom chains that had haunted him for so long. The real terror, he understood now, was not in the violence of the system, but in its ability to make that violence seem normal, necessary, inevitable. The real terror was in how it convinced good people to commit atrocities and call it duty. The real terror was in the lie that we have no choice. But we do have choices. We always have choices, and those choices, accumulated over time, made by enough people, could break even the strongest chains. Thaddeus Crane would never be a judge again. He would never recover his reputation in Virginia. His family was gone. His old life was over, but when he woke each morning at dawn, there were no longer chains dragging through his mind. There was only the work ahead, the next case, the next person who needed defending against a system designed to crush them. It was not enough, but it was something. And something was what you built freedom from. One choice at a time, one person at a time, one day at a time. The judge of Willow Bend had condemned himself that dawn when he chose conscience over complicity. But in that condemnation, he had also freed himself. And freedom, he had learned, was not a destination but a practice, not a state, but a continuous act of resistance against those who would take it away. The trial that unmade Virginia had not been Peterson's trial in Richmond. It had been Thaddeus's own trial by conscience in Willow Bend, the moment when he stopped serving the system and started serving justice. That choice had rippled out, touching Harrison, touching Hendricks, touching countless others who saw that resistance was possible. The system would continue. The chains were still there, binding millions. But they were not unbreakable. They never had been. They were maintained by the choices of individuals, and individuals could choose differently. Thaddeus Crane had chosen differently. And in that choice, in the terror and liberation of breaking free from the lies that bound him, he had become finally truly free. Not free from consequence, not free from struggle, but free to live according to his conscience, free to fight for justice, free to wake each morning without the weight of his own cowardice crushing him. It was not enough, but it was everything.